Hello and welcome to today's APBP webinar. We're delighted to have an opportunity to explore the new NACTO Urban Street Design Guide together. We have a great lineup of presenters. We're pleased that you've joined us. We are recording this webinar. We will be sending out the materials after the handouts after the webinar today. My name is Kit Keller. I'm Executive Director of the Association of Pedestrian and Bicycle Professionals, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to an exploration of what will likely be a tremendous change agent for cities throughout North America. If you're interested in obtaining continuing education for today's webinar, the information that you need to know is on your screen right now. Please, if you're attending at a site with more than, and there's a host, please make sure you sign in on a log sheet, and site hosts, please send in those sheets after the webinar. You can also download a certificate of attendance. We'd like to bring to your attention several upcoming webinars, and we hope that one or more of them will be of interest to you. On November the 13th, we will be looking at the Green Lane Project Phase 2. That's a free webinar, and Zach Vanderkoy and a team of experts, including some of the current Green Lane communities, are going to be explaining the process for making an application. You'll be interested to know that preliminary letters of interest are due on November 15th, and that process is designed to guide you to get everything you need to get done in order and in place to make the application deadline, the full application deadline, which is in 2014. Then we're back to a monthly webinar on November the 20th. APBP does offer monthly educational webinars. We encourage people to watch them together and build teams at your site, your location, whether it's a community, city, Bicycle Pedestrian Advisory Committee, consulting firm, any other group interested in building a more walkable, bicycle-friendly community. We also will be starting a new series on bicycle transit systems. It's a 4-part series, and we begin on December 4th and continue with one a month in January, February, and March of 2014. We have 4 excellent presenters today. We will be led off by David Vega-Barakowitz, who is Director of the Designing Cities Initiative for the National Association of City Transportation Officials, otherwise known as NACTO, the publishers of the guide. We will also hear from Michael Flynn, Director of Capital Planning of the New York City Department of Transportation, Michael King, Principal, Nelson Nygaard Consulting Associates, and Michael was the project manager for the NACTO Urban Street Design Guide, and I also might mention that he was recognized for his work on this and other products in the last year, and was awarded APBP's Professional of the Year Private Sector. So our continuing congratulations to Michael King. We'll also hear from Peter Kuntz, Division Manager, Signals, Street Lighting, and ITS at the Portland, Oregon Bureau of Transportation. And with that, I'd like to turn the presentation over to David. David, welcome.
Thank you, Kit, and thank you to APBP for hosting this really exciting kickoff webinar for NACTO. We're really thrilled to have the opportunity to present to such a wide audience today. Today's presentation is going to provide a brief introduction to the Urban Street Design Guide and give just a general background on a few highlights from the guide that Michael and Peter are going to be providing. Before we go into some of those more focused presentations, I do want to provide a little bit of background on the guide. Since kicking off the Cities for Cycling project in 2009 and our Designing Cities initiative in 2012, NACTO has really been sort of a leader in getting cities together to create a new set of city standards for city streets. In 2011, we released the first edition of our Urban Bikeway Design Guide, and today we're celebrating the publication of our first Urban Street Design Guide. And these publications are really already changing the game here in the United States. The guides face a legacy of street design guidance that is really significantly weighted towards rural and suburban highway design standards. We're moving from a paradigm of seeing city streets as an anomaly and an afterthought towards a celebration of their unique design characteristics and a real true recognition of the need for balance and public space in cities. The AASHTO has really been driving street design guidance at the national level since the Interstate Highway era. And the Green Book, along with these two other leading manuals, the Highway Capacity Manual and the MUTCD, have really formed the nexus of street design over the last 50 years. Prior to the Urban Street Design Guide's development, the impulse to write new guidance had already been coming to fruition in cities around the U.S. In 2010, New York City released its first street design manual, which is now going into its second edition. And in 2012, Boston released their complete street design guidelines, adding to a body of work that really spans from cities like San Francisco to Charlotte to Louisville and New Haven. But nothing parallel has existed at the national level, and previous work by groups like ITE and CNU, the Congress for New Urbanism, have really been pushing in the right direction, but don't always have, or haven't always had, the projects and the implementation to back them up. All of these guides have really been part of an effort to create spaces for people on city streets, and pioneering cities like New York, San Francisco, and Portland has really been leading the way to make these changes through a much faster and more strategic implementation process. Improvements that are using low-cost materials like planters, bollards, and markings have really been able to realize the benefits of full reconstructions in the short term. This area at Union Square in New York City has been turned into a space that's welcoming and safe for people walking and cycling. Now this movement is really spreading to cities all around the country. Here we can see a formerly unsafe arterial in Atlanta that has been made a whole lot safer and bikeable with the addition of a two-way cycle track. Beginning with its Cities for Cycling project in 2009, NACTO really began its sort of first foray into national design standards. The 2011 edition of the Bike Guide circumvented the stagnancy of other national guides, specifically the AASHTO Guide for the Development of Bicycle Facilities, which was extremely out of date and conservative, and had even allowed world-class bicycle facilities like Copenhagen-style protected bike lanes or cycle tracks that and had restricted the majority of engineers from using them out of fear of liability and safety concerns, but would gladly call a paved shoulder an appropriate bicycle facility. The Urban Bikeway Design Guide translated real-world game-changing projects like this Market Street in San Francisco into a set of standard treatments that could be applied in cities across the country. In addition, the guide was one of the first to use a kind of dynamic and highly visual layout, and I think it goes without saying it has been highly sort of accessible not only to engineers but to city leaders, to advocates, and to citizens who may not have seen these kinds of world-class designs on the street in other countries. The Bike Guide very quickly set off a string of ambitious projects all around the country. Here we see Atlanta, Austin, Salt Lake City, Charlotte, all projects completed under 1 year after the Bike Guide came out, and has really given cities a kind of permission slip to innovate. In 2011, in October, former U.S. DOT Secretary LaHood endorsed the guide and really signaled the way forward for transportation officials around the nation to embrace and implement it. A significant number of cities have adopted or endorsed it since then and leading up to that endorsement. And in August 2013, we were thrilled to see the FHWA issue a memorandum officially endorsing the guide and to distribute copies to each of their division offices around the country. However, the bike guide was really just one aspect of a much larger set of issues concerning U.S. cities and their streets. The tools, the performance measures, and the day-to-day practices of most city street departments and transportation departments, from traffic signals to transit, really remained rooted in an interstate era approach to highway design, which was predicated on making streets wider, more forgiving to rush hour traffic, and consequently much less bike and pedestrian friendly. The street design guide, like the bike guide, is rooted in NACTO's core mission of advancing the state of the practice through a peer-to-peer exchange and coalition. But where the bike guide filled a very clear niche, the street design guide deals with a much wider range of transportation issues, which really span all modes of traffic. The guide has 6 chapters which deal with street design issues at a variety of scales. These include streets, street design elements, interim design strategies, intersections, intersection design elements, and design controls. Like the bike guide, the street design guide utilizes a really rich and kind of dynamic visual layout, which not only gives cities the tools they need to design great streets, but presents the ideas and really the sort of vision, which is highly communicable to others who they're trying to get on board with these ideas. The guide takes a significant number of lessons that are being pioneered in NACTO cities all around the country and makes what we kind of call this sort of secret sauce available to cities all around the nation so they don't have to reinvent the wheel. In addition to the print guide, to keep the guide a really kind of living document, we built an interactive website which is really easy to use, which has additional case studies, photographs, and materials that will be updated on an ongoing basis to reflect the state of the practice. Just like the bike guide translated exemplary protected bike lane projects that were happening in a variety of cities around the country, the street design guide takes projects that embody some of its main principles and translates these into guidance for cities around the country. The guide also is going to engage some new concepts, including shared streets, creating new standards around those, and really taking the best work from cities around the country and transforming this work into world-class street design standards. At the center of the guide is really a focus on how cities can begin to use kind of tactical and low-cost solutions on city streets, like this new public plaza in Philadelphia, and then to provide easily adaptable guidance for cities all around the country. Like the bike guide, the street design guide really pushes the envelope by highlighting projects that have had a kind of outstanding impact on the landscape of transportation, and making these available to transportation officials from Phoenix to Wichita to Boston and San Francisco. Parklets are a great example and are now in over 10 cities around the country and growing. Like the bike guide, again, majority of the topics in the guide have 3 levels of guidance: critical, recommended, and optional. The street design guide is really governed by kind of 6 overarching principles, which I just want to lay out here before turning it over to Mike Flynn. The first and foremost in my mind is really that streets are public spaces and need to be analyzed, conceived, and designed as such. Streets should really be judged as much for their capacity to attract foot traffic and be hospitable to those sitting and watching as for their ability to move cars, bikes, or buses where they need to go. Great streets are great for business, and I do want to call out this Measuring the Street report that was released by New York City DOT just this year. You know, cities are really realizing that streets are as much of an economic asset as they are a functional part of a traffic system, and that a really well-designed street has the potential to generate higher revenues for businesses and boost higher values for homeowners. Streets can and should be changed. Transportation engineers and designers have the ability to work flexibly within the right-of-way, and this includes moving curbs, changing alignments, daylighting corners, and also really reusing space in creative ways like installation of parklets and bike share stations and traffic calming strategies. Safety is really a paramount and driving consideration for street design, especially in urban areas. Over 34,000 people were killed in traffic crashes in 2012, and each one of these deaths and the hundreds of thousands that were injured are avoidable. Traffic engineers and planners can work together to do much better, and we believe that streets should be designed in such a way that people walking, biking, parking, and taking transit should all be able to cross paths safely. Streets are ecosystems. The guide contains a real wealth of information on items such as bioswales and pervious pavements. And lastly, I think this is one of the most important and sort of the charge to everyone who's listening today, that cities can act now. That the materials that you're using don't all have to be capital materials, and not every project necessarily needs to be realized in a 5 to 10 year time frame, but there are things that we can begin to do now that create public space, that make streets safer, and that enliven our cities. The Street Design Guide shows streets sort of that are in the process of becoming, in keeping with that Act Now and interim design strategy sort of framework. This is the street that's existing or before, an interim application using striping and markings, and a full reconstruction. Similarly, we emphasize the need to look at context, which is something that's been explored in a variety of guides to date, thinking about how streets change as they move through different land uses, from a strip mall arterial to a leafy boulevard to a busy downtown with bikes, buses, and people and cars interacting. Before I turn things over to Mike Flynn, I just want to briefly mention that on Tuesday, October 29th, NACTO kicked off at its second annual Designing Cities Conference in Phoenix an endorsement campaign which invited state and city transportation directors to sign on and support, sign a letter of support endorsing the guide, and we're already receiving a tremendous, really tremendous response to that. For those that are interested in incorporating the guide into their complete streets policies or adopting the guide through resolution and ordinance, I encourage you to reach out to NACTO directly to help you do that. We have a wealth of examples and precedents that we can share with you as you embed the guide at the local, county, MPO, and state level. And lastly, I do want to mention that everyone on the webinar today can pick up a copy of the guide through Island Press using the following promo code and get 20% off for those of you that don't have it already. But with that, I want to invite Michael Flynn, Director of Capital Planning at New York City DOT, to go a little bit more in depth on some of the interim design strategies in the Urban Street Design Guide.
Thanks, David. So I want to use this Act Now principle as a jumping off point I think that this is really, there are several things that make the guide unique, but this is, I think, something that's pretty revolutionary at the national level, but really in general, is this idea of not, letting the long term, I guess, be the enemy of the short term, and really trying to get some results quickly. So here are some of the typical challenges we face as professionals when we're doing long-term projects. And any one of these, as you know, can kind of throw a wrench into things, whether it be obtaining funding or justifying the need for funding for that project, building support from the public and also other key stakeholders like businesses, support from our elected officials, and the different kinds of approvals that we need to receive. So in the past, we've really only had two approaches to getting our projects in the ground. We could use kind of our immediate toolbox, our traffic control devices, our signs, signals, and markings, or we could do a really long-term project. And as we know, those long-term projects, a lot can set it back or even send it off the rails. I want to talk a little bit about our experience in New York and how we've tried to sort of find a middle ground between these. So the signs, signals, and markings, there is a lot you can do with them. We're all very familiar, I'm sure, with road diets, with more innovative approaches to signalization, but it is pretty limited. We tried adding some new approaches to this toolbox and broadening it a bit. We started with things like planters, landscaping, furniture, both movable and fixed. And some of our earliest projects use this kind of expanded toolbox of interim design strategies. Over time, we got a little bit more bold, I guess, and a little bit more sophisticated, and added things like colored pavement, both for dedicated lanes, but also for pedestrian space. That can include paint, but also epoxy gravel or truffle paint, as we call it. Use of stones, boulders as both seating, but also to provide protection from vehicles, and maybe even some limited construction work kind of on the surface that won't trigger all kinds of utility impacts or drainage impacts. This is an example of one of our earlier projects using that even more expanded toolbox. This is Madison Square, and you can see pretty much all those tools in use here. But lest we get too caught up in sort of the design side, we have to remember that there's a whole other kind of flip side, which is the programming, I guess, the programming, the operations, and how we use the street beyond just what we put out there and how we redesign it. There's ways to get more out of your street in terms of just how you use it over the time of day or over the days of the year. So if we think about this kind of expanded interim approach, it offers a few advantages. It's much quicker. We can do these types of things in months typically rather than years. We're talking, let's say, tens of thousands of dollars instead of hundreds or even millions. There are fewer approvals involved. On the other hand, it offers a little bit less design flexibility because you're not dealing with grading, you're not dealing with utilities, and so it's a little bit more limited. And the impact in general is going to be a little more short term because it has a shorter useful life. You'll either have to keep maintaining it or at some point reconstruct it. On the other hand, that long-term approach of construction, slower, more costly, more approvals, although it does afford you more flexibility. So in summary, some of the benefits of this interim approach are that you can quickly reallocate space. You can show people that it works. People, once they realize the benefits, you tend to grow your support from the public and from elected officials, and it allows you some time to gain funding for that higher cost long-term build out. And like I said, sometimes you really need to eventually make it permanent, either because it makes more sense from a maintenance perspective, but also, let's be honest, there's some intangible benefit of permanency. This is Times Square. This was the before. and this is what it will soon look like. It's in construction right now, so I guess this is kind of our signature project in the last few years. But there are many others where we teed it up with a interim approach while we built the support, raised the money, and gained those approvals we needed to build it long term. So I really think that this is taken from the guide. So the guide endorses this sort of phased or two-phased approach. Instead of just looking at this one long-term project, why don't we get something in the ground, demonstrate that it works, build support, while we keep working in parallel towards long-term build-out. This is basically the approach we're taking in New York, and we've found that it works great, and it delivers many benefits. I'm repeating some slides from David, but I just want to reinforce the guide illustrates this, I think, in a really helpful way, and this is something you'll probably want to use in your own projects to those you need to win over. This idea of, what's there now, what could we do relatively quickly, and what would a long-term vision be that we can work towards. All right, so I'm going to jump into some of the specifics in the guide in this interim design strategies chapter. Basically, it divides it into 4 categories: moving the curb, parklets, temporary street closures, and interim public plazas. Each of these, or some of them, have some subcategories too. With moving the curb, one of the big ones is interim sidewalk widening. It can be really complex to move a curb line because of drainage, again, because of utilities, catch basins, things like that. In many cases, we don't need to wait to do that permanently. There are things we can do in the meantime that will give more pedestrian space, that will traffic calm, and the guide definitely encourages this. A couple of examples from New York. You saw the one on the right, that's Union Square. That's more recent, where we really started to get creative with different types of separation, assigning different types of lanes for bicyclists and pedestrians, planters. You can even see a statue of Andy Warhol there. And on the left is one of a more early approach, maybe a little bit more rudimentary, where we just used flexible plastic bollards and some planters. But it got the same effect. That was at a busy transit hub in the Bronx, where you really had, you can't see it here, but you really had at rush hour a lot of sidewalk crowding. Next up is traffic calming. So basically, anywhere at a mid-block in particular that you'd want to narrow the road down, maybe to provide a crossing, or maybe just to physically and visually narrow it to slow speeds. A lot of places have already done this around the country, where you basically can keep that channel along the curb for the drainage, and you don't have to worry about all the complexity involved in building that out. That's a real quick way to do traffic calming. A way we've adapted it in New York is for what we called our 6.5 Avenue project, which connected a whole bunch of public arcades and plazas in Midtown Manhattan between 6th and 7th Avenues with these new mid-block crossings. And so we used that truffle paint and these flexible bollards and some of our standard benches to not only create a safer mid-block crossing, but also create kind of a little mini public space. Bike corrals are also something that's been around a while. We've seen a lot of cities around the country be out in front on these. We're actually more recent, a little more recent to the game in New York, but we're now pursuing it pretty aggressively, where you take one or more parking spots and provide bike parking. Generally, these types of programs are application-based or really dependent on businesses coming to you. You want that kind of buy-in, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, just the general need for buy-in and community partners to make a lot of these strategies successful. A couple of examples. I don't think I need to say much about bike share, but similar to bike corrals, this is another way of reimagining the parking lane, providing a really useful service without having to impinge on the sidewalk space, especially in areas where you have limited sidewalk space. City Bike is going pretty swimmingly here. And that brings us to the next major topic here, or treatment here, which is parklets. A lot of different names for them: pop-up plaza, parklets, pop-up plazas. I think Italy was probably, and Europe in general, was one of the first places to roll these out. Is this picture from Italy, David? No? Oh, sure looks like. but you're seeing this a lot more in other places at this point. And the guide offers really detailed, for the first time, really detailed design guidance on how to site these, how to design them, how to deal with maintenance and partnerships. In New York, it's an application-driven program. Businesses apply, hopefully more than one at a time. They can kind of group together. We want to see that support, and we want to see them do a little bit of homework before they approach us. That ensures us, that this is really going to be a winning location. Something that's pretty important is you can see this sign in the center of the image here that reminds the public that this is a public space. It doesn't belong to customers of any particular business, even if it was requested by that business, and they may even take it upon themselves to clean it and put out the furniture. It is a public space, so we want to be really clear about that not being privatized. Temporary street closures. We know sort of street fairs and festivals, but cities are getting a lot more creative about how we do this, how you program it, how you locate it. And I think a big difference is working a lot more closely with the communities, with the businesses, with the community organizations on how you program these so that it's really pertinent to the people who live there, so that the businesses who are locally based are really represented. And this is a way to let communities reimagine their streets and realize that there's more you can do with it before you kind of come in and do a longer term project. It's just a way of changing people's perception of their streets and realize that they have a sense of ownership. Play streets are similar, but are really tailored to places where you expect children, particularly schools, but also adjacent to playgrounds or areas where you think there'll be a lot of that kind of activity. In New York, we partner with our Police Athletic League. We've been doing this for years, where they really take the lead on working with the schools and the communities to implement these, to put out the barricades during the hours that it's closed to vehicle traffic, and even to program it. Then you have your pedestrian streets where it's closed on a weekend or ciclovia. Actually, that's a different category. Sorry, I'm going to jump ahead. I think an important consideration for pedestrian streets is that it has that local flavor and that it should be customized. You can see here a few examples in the upper right. This is Bastille Day in a neighborhood in Brooklyn that has a real French kind of character, where they actually put sand in the street and do petanque, which is sort of like bocce. I hope I pronounced that right, which is a typical French activity. In the middle, this is a neighborhood in Queens. You can see the folks playing dominoes. And then in the lower left, that's the East Village, and I think it's either say a slam poet. So they had more cultural and artistic kind of activities going on. Markets are kind of self-explanatory, where you have either food markets or other kinds of markets. You can leverage that and have that synergy where it activates the street and may sort of give you the impetus to do a larger pedestrianization of the street, temporary or full-time. And finally, open streets, which are sort of a larger version of the the weekend street closures. I guess a lot of us know the ciclovia in Bogota and ciclavia in LA, and many, many other cities are now rolling this out. Here in New York, we call it Summer Streets, and it runs up kind of the center of Manhattan from the Brooklyn Bridge to Central Park, almost 7 miles. Heavily programmed, all different kinds of activities, from even zip lines and physical activities, exercise, to performances, interactive, like this dance class. Last but not least, interim public plazas, which basically are a way of creating public space quickly in advance of a longer term project, and leverage the interest and the activity that you may already have in that community. The guide gives really detailed design guidance on siting it, on specific design, separation, furniture, pavement markings. It's really pretty comprehensive. So a few examples locally here. This is Pearl Street Plaza was one of our earliest ones, especially where we started to kind of have fun with it. We used this day glow green, and then it was replaced by a public art installation that you can see from up above, the photos taken from the Manhattan Bridge bike and pedestrian path. So look, seen from above, it was a pretty striking mural, as well as public art sculptures. This example is from Philadelphia. So you can see planters, furniture, and kind of creative coloring with the pavement. I'll talk a little bit about the New York City Plaza program because I think it can provide some instructive information on the soup to nuts of how other places might pursue temporary plazas with an eye towards permanent plazas. Our plaza program is a application-based program. That's good because it shows that you have some level of support already, and it also shows that you have a pretty strong maintenance partner. We prioritize areas that are high need because they lack open space, basically on a per capita basis, and also because they tend to be lower income. Those would be the areas that we target. So you can see on this map, the blue areas we would try to shy away from because they have an existing plaza project within the community board district, our sort of local political district. The red areas tend to have a lack of open space per capita. The yellow areas are lower income, and the orange areas are a combination of a lack of open space and lower to moderate income. So those would be really the areas that we try to target. You can see a portion of the application here. The criteria that we look for, again, besides the lack of open space and the income, we want to see demonstrated community initiatives. So that could be things like that the community partner is already programming it pretty heavily with different kinds of events. There should have already been a community board meeting and a resolution passed in support of this. Sorry about that. And we want to see a good context that would make sense, where you already have good amounts of pedestrian traffic or the potential for it because of retail or other kinds of destinations. We make sure that we do pretty thorough public outreach. We do it in the form of interactive charrettes where we really let people kind of use their imagination in terms of what they'd like to see design-wise, but also event-wise, programming-wise. That also helps maximize the buy-in. In terms of how we split responsibilities, the city basically agrees to fund the construction, to do the design and the engineering work, kind of all that technical heavy lifting. What we ask of the maintenance partner is that they do the outreach, they provide input into the design, and they do almost all of the maintenance, essentially. There's some requirements in terms of indemnification, and they're the ones who are in the lead in terms of programming and events and the long-term operation and maintenance funding. How do they pay for that? They have a few pretty big options at their disposal. They're allowed to do certain kinds of sub-concessions like food kiosks or other kinds of kiosks. They can do limited sponsorships. That could be private, like corporate sponsorships, but also individual or charitable sponsorships. And they can also do sponsored events. But all that money is required to go into the maintenance of the site. So it guarantees that whatever money is raised there goes back into that site. So I think that point kind of bears repeating, and I'll end on this note, is that it's more than just what you design, and the guide speaks to this. It's really also about how you activate the space, how you make sure it's a destination, as close to year-round as it can be, as close to basically 24/7, 365 as it can be. And that's going to help build the support you need to see it through to a long-term project. It'll best ensure that it's a successful space. With that, we turn it over to Mike, right? Kit?
Thank you so much. That was brilliant. Both of the presentations were excellent. And we are now launching a poll to help us understand how many people are attending at your particular location. Those of you in the viewing audience, we do encourage you to gather friends, colleagues, advocates, professionals, elected officials together to watch these and other APBP webinars together so that you can build a team. And that's why we're asking you to let us know how many people are at your location. Many of the metropolitan planning organizations are actually increasingly hosting these webinars. So this is a bit different webinar today. It's one that is free, and so many people are watching it individually, and we appreciate your response. We're now going to hear from Michael King, and welcome, Michael. And we want to make sure that Michael King is unmuted because we're not hearing Michael King. So, Michael, you are on the air.
Oh, now you have unmuted me?
Yes, you are unmuted.
And can you see my screen?
And we can see your screen. You are
okay.
good to go.
Good, thank you. I first want to just say that thanks for that plug there in the beginning, Kit. But any successful project has a really, really good client. And so I want to extend all the credit over to David Vega-Bragowitz and Linda Bailey. And if there's any confusion, my name is project manager on this thing, but if there's any confusion, it's David's baby. And he really wrote the scope, it's all credit goes to him. So what I want to do is talk about 3 items. Intersection design principles, some traffic signal principles, and a bit about crossing the street. Let's see if I can make my screen move.
The best way to do that is in the lower part of your screen. You'll see some arrows, and you can just touch the button to go forward. It's the lower left side.
Oh, look at that. Okay. So the intersection chapter, these are the subheadings of this. So I'm going to talk about the principles, and then in the intersection design chapter, I'll talk about these items. I think there's about 6 chapters in the book. So intersections, let's get to, I think David talked about 6 sort of overriding principles, 6, and so here's 6 sort of intersection principles that we have we coalesced around. The first one is probably the most important one, which is streets. Intersections of streets should be as compact as possible. This doesn't mean small. This means that they need to be sort of one lane. Every entry lane should have a receiving lane kind of thing. It shouldn't have a lot of excess space for drivers to have to make decisions. You should make it tight and efficient. This helps in channeling traffic, but also helps in crossing the street and minimizes conflicts and speeds up traffic signals and things. The second one is about intersections do not exist in isolations, and they should not be analyzed in isolation. They're part of networks. So talk about overall travel speed, not a particular level of service, for example. Integrating time and space is about, there's a design and there's operation. Intersections are you rob Peter, you got to pay Paul, and we need to be very cognizant of that. They are shared spaces. They're not sort of for one mode in particular. Whenever you have excess space, especially at triangles, Ys, X's, things like that, try to convert as much of that to public space. And think about the future. Always think about the future. And that means not only sort of the future is going to be more cars, maybe the future is going to be less cars. So here are these next 2 slides. Pretty much everything I know about intersection is can be captured in these 2 slides. This is from a city in China about 13 years ago, and this is a city in the Netherlands. And I'll go back. They're about the same scale, about the same size, about the same sort of photograph. And you can see that what we have is this sort of wasteland of space. And over here you have the space is all chopped up. This is what I mean about sort of compact, where everything is organized so the drivers aren't just sort of left to their own devices. We need to sort of take control of some of these things. Here's another set of a quick time lapse from a city in Mexico, and we'll see this woman here and her little child, and we can see that the cars, the green taxis, are turning at such a high rate of speed, and so when this woman has to cross the street, it's a sprint. And this is the kind of stuff that we have allowed our cities to become. These sorts of things where when you walk your kid home from school, you have to sprint to cross the street. Here's another little example of a sort of an overly large intersection where there's a right turn lane. And so if you start to just draw the lines, a lot of what I do is just draw lines. You draw the lines and you start to you fill in the gaps, and suddenly you can see that this island or whatever the thing is on the left could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 crosswalk bars bigger, and would affect nothing. No traffic would be, no cars would be inconvenienced at all. And in Phoenix, we just took this picture from the NACTO last Monday, the NACTO conference there. Took this on Sunday morning, and you see the new purple temporary curve extension matches the existing curve extension across the street. Here's an example from Portland where we can start to see how you take this intersection and just by moving things out a bit, moving the stop line out a bit, you can make the intersection more compact. It's courtesy of Michael Ronkin. It's a photograph from Washington, D.C. where this is North Capitol and I can't remember the other street, New York Avenue, I believe. And you can see that here's a pretty large truck. It's a highway kind of expressway kind of truck, and it's got a wide load. There's no load on it, but it's making a pretty wide turn. And you see how it's making the turn the whole entire street. So what happens is the curb on the lower left-hand corner here is still pretty tight. So we can have a good tight curve, and we can still allow our big trucks to turn around because they have a signal. They can use the whole entire street. Here, actually, down the street from that is you start to convert all this excess space into public space, sort of an entry into a thing. And here's another example from New York, where we convert all this excess space into more usable public space. Here's an example from the guide. We were talking about this sort of complex intersection exercise. We'll probably want to do another webinar specifically on that. And the last thing I'll say about intersections is test. Go out there with cones, paint, tape, get your fire guys, come out there. It looks really small, have them drive around. Maybe it's okay. This ended up being a 14-foot wide laneway, and they could all make the turns. So if the fire people are happy, then it's probably going to happen. Second thing, traffic signal principles. And I know I'm probably running behind time, so I'll just run through these. Shorter cycles. Short means less delay. The whole thing about rob Peter to pay Paul. Signals are a good place to put to do mode prioritization. Fewer phases is better than more phases. So anytime you can kind of simplify intersections, that's going to be better for delay. Synchronize the target speeds, something that that maybe we should do a little bit more of. The difference between on and off peak or rush hour and off peak timing is really critical because sometimes you time your signals for rush hour and then that gives you really long green times for off peak. Unnecessary and just leads to speeding and people waiting for hours to cross the street. We like fixed time signals in cities. We don't like buttons. Let's see if I can get this thing to move again. This is the green wave in Portland. And one of my favorites, which is the leading pedestrian interval. 6th Avenue and 23rd Street, Manhattan. And here it is in action, where we're going to see the woman with the stroller on the left-hand side, and we're going to see the 2 or 3 people on the right-hand side. And you can notice that they get the walk light before the green light comes on. Here's the green light, and they're pretty much across the street before the cars even start to turn. So that's how LPI works. Driver still didn't yield at the end, but at least the kids got across the street. So last thing, crossing the street. It's an old problem. This is Pompeii. They had to cross their streets. And a little bit of history, we need to understand that back in the 20s and the 30s, the auto industry really actively changed the paradigm for streets, and invented the term jaywalking and changed a lot of the laws in favor of driving. So this is something that maybe it's going to reverse course in the next couple of decades, so that we can get away from this kind of stuff, which is, here is the Art Museum in Philadelphia at the end of the Ben Franklin Parkway, which is one of America's greatest streets, and it ends in this sort of chain bollard kind of cow path and a 6-lane road to the Rocky Steps. We should be doing this kind of stuff. There's the entrance to the Moscone Center, and there's the crosswalk. So think about crossing the streets in terms of locations, pedestrian, the walking network, and then get into the design. We go into this a little bit in the guide. So walking networks are really important to explore. This is from Charlotte, and it's not necessarily the driving network. So there's paths and sort of ways that people go around. Here's a little excerpt from a talk we gave last week in Phoenix. This is the driving network in downtown Phoenix, and overlaid here's the walking network. So there's different layers of information that we need to sort of understand as we're laying out our trying to get people across the street. In the guide, these are 3 excerpts from the guides about different types of crossing facilities based on the roadway type, travel speed, and things like that. And then finally get into the design, which is taking a 4-lane street and putting in a mid-block crosswalk. Here's from an image from the design, and here's some images from actually how this plays out in reality. You notice this one doesn't have any crosswalk striping, but it does have a nice little island which protects people waiting in the middle. And that's my last slide.
Thank you, Michael. Now we will transfer the program to Peter Kuntz. Welcome, Peter. And let's make sure that we have unmuted Peter Kuntz. And our apologies for the earlier background noise. We did take care of that and hopefully have resolved that question. So, Peter, you're on the air.
Okay, thanks, Kit. Last but not least, I'll take on design controls. Design controls are the assumptions that result in the implementation of transportation solutions, I like to say, and they're fundamental elements such as travel speed, the types and sizes of vehicles and their characteristics, the time period they will be studied. They're all covered in the design guide, and I'll just highlight some of the assumptions that we've used in Portland and that are covered in the guide. The first part, I'll of course describe a bit about what the traditional procedures have been, and then how NACTO distinguishes what we expect in the urban environment. It's important to note that the high-quality design, though, is really relies on this understanding of analytical processes, and the assumptions really do matter. Design controls should work towards your intended outcome, not against it. So thinking about the manual and how it's organized, the design assumptions are in the back, because you really shouldn't have your assumptions up front. You should think about what you expect out of the street before you drive through the numbers essentially to get what you're trying to achieve. So really beginning with the end in mind is part and parcel to this discussion here with the assumptions. And I'll start out with design hour as I go through the guide, because that's really important as the basis for design. Our common practice is to study the peak 15 minutes of traffic using the highway capacity manual. That's what we do in the city of Portland to assess whether a development has adequate transportation for moving cars. We study the 2-hour peak, but then narrow down to that 15-minute period, and that leads to facilities of this nature that maybe are bigger, maybe aren't as urbane as they should be. So to that extent, we want to try to change that paradigm. The AASHTO Green Book is part of that as well, as it focuses on the 30th highest hourly volume. And if you think about the 30th highest hour of the year, that really is accounting for only less than 1/3% of the time on the street throughout the year. So if you're thinking about trying to create a space in the city, you really shouldn't be designed for that 0.34% of the year. So the Urban Street Design Guide focuses on thinking broadly about the day, thinking about peak spreading. Of course, in the big city, we have congestion, and it does happen through those peaks. So maybe you don't study the peak 15-minute. Maybe you look at the peak hour or even 2 hours of time and think about how the analysis of the second hour works as opposed to just that peak 15-minute period. The NACTO guide introduces some really nice concepts in terms of thinking about all hours of the day. And Michael talked a little bit about thinking about signal timing settings for 8 p.m., thinking about what you need during the lunch hour. So those needs are different, and the day in the life of the street that's described in the manual really does highlight the need to do specific things with traffic signals and on-street parking regulation, and even transit and HOV lanes to think about how we foster multimodal transportation that is beneficial to cities. Streets need to be designed for peak intervals of traffic, but that may also lead to failure in terms of creating a safe and attractive environment throughout the other portions of the day. So it's that trade-off of when do you need a mobility function, when might you highlight and improve the accessibility of the street, and then also focusing on maybe neighborhood emphasis where need be, and thinking broadly about all hours of the day as opposed to those peak 15 minutes. I'll transition into design year because part of the look and analysis of streets is really what we're doing today, but then also what is coming down the line. And we talked about this a little bit earlier in the guide related to how we have these transportation modeling efforts that maybe hold us back from creating the sort of streets that we want. So it's often difficult to project and to predict what the land use projections will be in the future, but we have to do our level best to try to think about what the traffic needs will be and whether we want those traffic needs to be met within the districts that we're working in. Of course, from, again, the AASHTO perspective, the AASHTO Green Book talks about the highway engineers asking for a maximum design period in the range of 15 to 25 years. And oftentimes what that looks like in practice is this straight line projection. And this is actually a slide I borrowed from the Sightline Institute, where they looked at a project where they had 3 different projections represented by that yellow, green, and red line there, where they had 3 different projections of future traffic on a facility, and then measured with the data that those dots on the slide are the actual trend that occurred of traffic volume. So whether or not traffic is growing is something that's in question, and you could think about what we have in terms of problems with a design year, thinking about what is that, whether we're modeling an unconstrained vehicle demand for 20 years, or whether that's really what people want to do in the future, whether that's what's the cost of gas in 2030, or asking those sorts of questions to ask whether we're designing for the right set of circumstances that we want 30 years out. I like this picture because it shows an example where we've in Portland where we've kind of reserved space and capacity, or reserved space for future traffic capacity that we might have thought was coming 20 years ago. And so this is one of those elements where if you can reimagine what this should look like, of course, we have a project underway to do just that, is try to figure out if there's some sort of simple solution that we can do to try to make this more of an urban setting. How we've moved in the city is really looking at designing here under the climate lens. That's something that we hadn't done before, but this climate action plan that was finished in 2009 asked about greenhouse gas emissions as a part of our performance measures that I'll talk to in a little bit more detail on the next few slides. And this is particularly timely given that the World Meteorological Organization just released a report today describing that we have more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere than we ever have had, and it reached a new record in 2012. So that plan identifies the transportation hierarchy, and this is something that I'm sure some of you are familiar with, of course, thinking about how we put pedestrians and bicycles on top of the transportation triangle, if you will, thinking about prioritizing the various modes as we move through creating spaces that are more urban in nature. And this picture on the left shows exactly how we've done that in downtown Portland, a buffered bike lane where a travel lane used to be, and then of course space for pedestrians on the sidewalk, and then the public transit light rail being the crossing element there. So we've done that on this particular intersection, and feel like we're moving in the right direction. But it does take time to create these sort of projects, as you learned earlier. Performance measures is the last piece I want to talk about. As an engineer, I like to measure things and I like to meet targets, and really anything with numbers is what motivates us as engineers often. So having performance measures that first define failure. And of course, the Skagit River Bridge is just north of Portland a little ways, where so that's a failure that engineers can relate to, and that's something that we work hard as engineers to try to avoid. But the failure that we have in the highway capacity mail for transportation-related aspects at signalized intersections is just 80 seconds per vehicle. And the problem with that in the urban environment is really twofold. One is that it focuses on just vehicles, and by vehicles I don't mean bikes. It's focusing on cars. And the second part of that is it looks at the traffic signal and not a system of intersections. So in Portland, we've been looking at different performance measures beyond delay per vehicle, thinking about crashes per mile of highway from the highway safety mail. And that's a national document that's emerging as a potential tool, but it's much more, at this point, it's very highway focused. And then the Guide to Sustainable Transportation Performance Measures is one document that the EPA put together that you wouldn't necessarily think of as a transportation document, but it does have some of our performance measures that we've used over time. And this slide describes Portland's look at both bike traffic over time, over our bridges into the downtown area, but then also reported bike crashes, and we call it a crash index that allows us to monitor how we're doing in terms of safety, and not just about moving as many cars as possible. As I mentioned, the numbers. I love numbers, so mode split targets is something else that we took out of the Climate Action Plan, and the slide here shows the mode split for Portland as it is today, and then what we're targeted for. And if you think about this target, thinking about going from driving alone from 66% to 30% and biking from 8% to 25%, it really sets the stage for how we have to look at the infrastructure to try to make that big objective happen. So it really presents a challenge for us as engineers to think differently about the space that we have available to us within the right-of-way. So back to that level of service discussion, one thing I would change if I could with that measure is just look at person delay. Think about incorporating pedestrian delay, bike delay, and transit delay as a part of that. Our vehicle standards today don't accept 80 seconds of delay per vehicle, but there's no procedure that we use to consider greater than 80 seconds of delay for pedestrians. So I would put that at the front, and that's what the Urban Street Design Guide does, is talks about performance measure by mode and singles out thinking more broadly in terms of just having vehicles be at the forefront of what we use to make decisions in our public realm. And I think David mentioned this before. It bears repeating that the New York City DOT has done a fantastic job. That measuring the street document is one that we are looking at in Portland as as a model for how do you think more broadly about the transportation system? How do you measure the street? How do you frame the discussion about how we're going to change those spaces so that they're meeting our needs and create more dynamic urban spaces? That's really the direction that we see us going in the future, is thinking more broadly about this. We don't want to leave our traditional transportation analysis behind. We'd like to think about not just a point analysis, but a network considerations. Think about not just intersections, but systems. So trying to move away from that point level focus and trying to highlight the range of tools that engineers need to make improvements in the system. And so that's part and parcel to how we think we'll move forward in Portland to create a more dynamic city, a better place to live, work, and play. So applying the Urban Street Design Guide, just want to leave you with a couple thoughts on what we would love to see APVP professionals take from this webinar is really challenging the assumptions, taking a look at the engineering details and saying, well, there is another way. It's not just one document out there that describes all that we can do. The NACTO Urban Street Design Guide really does look at changing the paradigm, as David mentioned. Also, beyond engineering, the planning forecast. What would 2030 look like? What does the future hold in terms of traffic growth? And trying to think about how we use policies to trump traditional practices, but overall take responsibility for the details. Often I see that engineers are often asked for the solutions, when in reality we don't have a monopoly on the solutions. So we really take you as the lead to move us forward in this discussion. And with that, I'll thank you for your time, and I'll pass it on over back to Kit.
Thank you so much, Peter. We really appreciate your presentation, and particularly I'd like to call out the user hierarchy that you had in your slide presentation. That is actually something that we saw on the international scan on pedestrian safety and mobility, pedestrian and bicyclist safety and mobility. That international scan was sponsored by the Federal Highway Administration, by AASHTO, and also by NCHRP. And we saw that hierarchy. We made a recommendation as a team that needed to be the hierarchy if we were to move to a safer street environment where road users 8 to 80 would be able to utilize roads and be safe, and we could reduce the number of crashes, fatalities, and injuries that we were seeing compared to other to the countries we visited, really, where they had made significant changes in the way the road is designed in order to really affect that hierarchy. So we have lots and lots of questions, and I think I'm going to begin with the one that is probably the most commonly asked here so far, and that is to direct the question to David. David, would you let the audience know how NACTO is going about working with Federal Highway Administration to disseminate the information in this guide?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Kit. NACTO and the Federal Highway Administration have an ongoing working group that's going to be looking at both issues in the NACTO Urban Bikeway Design Guide and the Urban Street Design Guide. Federal Highway Administration has already done a review of the guide, and together we're looking at some opportunities to sort of get information out to different stakeholders on sort of identifying where there may be any discrepancies between the guide's recommendations and items in the MUTCD, and then also sort of identifying what the next steps on those particular items are, whether or not it would be a particular marking that we're looking at, or if it's a particular provision within the MUTCD that we would want further research on, or would like to see more nuanced language or additional support clauses on. And then, Actually, I would also add that it's going to be it will likely be something similar to what we had done on the bike guide, where we sort of looked at each treatment within that and sort of identified its official status as per the METCD. Albeit, I will say this may take the form of more of a frequently asked questions to sort of quickly identify some of those issues that people may have questions about.
And then let's take a look at how this guide interacts with the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices.
So I would say, I think in contrast to the bike guide, which has a significant amount of information on signs and markings, this guide is really actually much more, it has much more of a parallel to the AASHTO Green Book. So a lot of the, like Peter mentioned, a lot of the comparison is really with the Green Book or with the IT CNU manual. There are particular instances where we do have, we do offer some information that would be outside of the manual for uniform traffic control devices. One example of that is obviously shared streets is something that there aren't that many examples of in the United States, and as a result, we don't have a shared street sign that's standard in the METCD. That's one place that I can see some difference. Another, and I think Mike did a really great job of, Mike King did a really great job of emphasizing this, is beginning to sort of look at how we can introduce more specific language into the METCD for justifying pedestrian networks. Currently, there's provisions that talk about hospitals and schools, but there aren't always specific clauses within the METCD to sort of look at building entrances or alleys or other sort of specific pedestrian network considerations that we think to have a really full and thorough METCD should really be covered as well. So those kinds of issues are already in discussion with FHWA, and we have a really productive dialogue going with them.
Great, thank you. There were a couple of questions specifically for Peter, so while the presentation is still fresh, let's see if we can ask those questions of Peter. Would you provide the name of the document that you referenced with information about outcomes from New York City?
Oh yeah, it's Measuring the Street. It's actually David and Michael probably are best to highlight that, but I think if you Google Measuring the Street, you would quickly find that. It was actually the IT Journal had the executive summary of that published directly in their, I think it was the July edition. So Institute of Transportation Engineers are going to be familiar with that.
Okay, and while we're with you, Peter, let's ask another question. One of the listeners was very interested in Portland's 2030 commute mode share goals. When were those goals set? Which agencies set them? And how did you go about obtaining any public input, or was there a databasis involved in setting those ambitious percentages?
Yeah, very ambitious. So the Climate Action Plan was a project that was done 2007, 2008 timeframe. The former mayor Sam Adams led that initiative. And one thing I should note is that mode split target is not adopted in our transportation system plan. We're in the process of updating the transportation system plan that takes input from the bike master plan, the Climate Action Plan, and all the other plans that we have at the city. But this is the target commute mode share that was described as a way to, if we met those targets, it would help us reduce our greenhouse gases emissions to meet the targets that were set in the Climate Action Plan. So this is kind of coming from that top level, high level look, both of the city and the county, and what will go into the transportation system plan is still yet to be determined. But it is consistent with our bike master plan, which also highlighted that 25% bikes mode split as a a really really ambitious goal.
Thanks, Peter. And this is a question I think best addressed to either David or to are coming in related to the Americans with Disabilities Act and how some of the designs, such as the plaza designs, are or are not working for people who are using canes or guide dogs. And I recall that you have had conversations about that and have had experts come in to look at what you're doing in New York. So if you talk about that for a bit, that would be really helpful.
So I think there are a number of different sort of strategies that cities have been using to make really ensure that those with disabilities are familiar with those street designs. And I will say that those designs typically will have truncated domes where the new intersection would be, or sort of where the new curb line would be, so that people understand that they're entering a space which is akin to the sidewalk. One of the other ways that I know that there's been a lot of outreach to those communities to actually do walkthroughs on many of these projects to sort of better understand both the materiality and then sort of the edge conditions in those spaces, as well as sort of setting up using kind of hard objects like bollards and boulders to really sort of enhance the edge at the entrance locations. And I think that that's been successful. Obviously, there are trade-offs with those designs, and another place I'd call out, and there's been a tremendous amount of research done in the UK on accessibility with shared spaces. Michael King was actually involved in a project in Longfellow Street in Santa Monica that I think did a really good job of working with the community there on accessibility issues with that new street design. But again, I will say it's an emerging field, and there's definitely room for sort of more understanding and more specific design guidance having to do with ATA, especially.
I would just second that, David, and I would say, in particular with some of these interim strategies that are at the roadway grade, it's not always crystal clear, in PROAG or any of the ADA guidance, how it always fits into that scenario, where the pedestrian area, quote, and the drivable area are very distinct, and of course with shared streets too, I think it's where it gets tricky. So I would agree that more dialogue is needed, and maybe even some more specificity on the ADA side for those kinds of scenarios.
And David, thank you. Another question for you. What does endorsement by a city mean, endorsement of the guide, and what would a city need to do to endorse that guide?
So, just last Tuesday, we emailed a significant number of large and mid-sized cities around the country and every state DOT an invitation from our president, NACTO's president, Jeanette Sada-Khan, to endorse the guide, and that basically included a sort of form letter for that city to put on their letterhead to issue an official endorsement. We're going to be running that campaign through May 1st. And, I will sort of stress the goal isn't really just to get, a big pile of endorsements. What we're really also trying to do is start a lot of conversations and start a lot of review all around the country to not only sort of explore some of these concepts and help people become more familiar with urban street design, but also to start a dialogue on some important issues that we call out in the guide. And a big part of that is creating awareness. And I think that the endorsement campaign, while we would like to collect a significant number of endorsements, both at the city and the state level is foremost about creating awareness of some of the key city street design issues that we talk about in the guide.
Great, thank you. And we have about 9 minutes left for questions. I have forwarded a few of the questions to our presenters so that they would have a chance to prepare a moment or two before you just jumping in and asking, are there any questions that I have forwarded to you that you would like to respond to at this time? And I'll start with David. And then I'll go to Michael.
Well, one of the questions that came up when we were doing this was the issue of kind of how do you reach out to your state DOT. And again, I will highlight there's a lot more. When we originally released the bike guide, I think that the level of interest and support in what we were doing at the state level was not necessarily there. That has really changed, and that was one of the reasons that we mailed every state DOT in the country 2 copies of the guide and invited them to endorse. Is that we're seeing a level of partnership between cities and states that I think is really unprecedented, and sort of seeing the guide as a tool that you can use to sort of, as a city, communicate some of your priorities, I think is a really important thing to continue to stress. And through our campaign, we're definitely going to be doing a lot of direct outreach to the states, and are really hoping that state DOTs will also come to us with questions and feedback as well. Kit, if you wanted to throw out a few of the other questions that had come in on your end, that would be fine with us.
Okay, fabulous. Peter Kuntz, I forwarded a number of questions to you. Lots of interest in what you're doing in Portland. Would you care to respond to any of those that I forwarded to you?
Sure. There was a question about the 2010 highway capacity mail and its move away from delay as an indication of failure at intersections. I think that I know the highway capacity mail has tried to strive towards more focus on multimodal travel. I think one of the challenges, of course, is the funding of that research. And the bicycle research explicitly, as we went through and looked at that manual as a potential for applications for analyzing bicycle movement in the city of Portland, we found that the level of service for just a standard bike lane was a very high grade. So you could have a bike lane adjacent to fast-moving traffic and have an adequate level of service, and no provision for things like cycle tracks or other protected lanes. So while the 2010 HCM has moved in the right direction, still feel like it's a ways away from what is in the realm of what we could implement to make our bike network live up to the platinum standard that we hope to achieve or we hope to continue on with as a city.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to ask that Deborah from our office, Deborah Gakes, who is our webinar program manager and does a great job at that. Deb, if you will please post the slide that showed where all of the presenters are from. We've had a request to show that slide again. So if we can move from Q&A to that slide, that would be helpful. It seems to me that one of the reasons that the Federal Highway Administration, AASHTO, and NCHRP funded and initiated the international scan on pedestrian and bicyclist safety and mobility was to look at what other countries were doing and to learn from those countries and bring ideas back to the to the U.S. in this instance. David, I believe that NACTO had done an analysis after the scan recommendations were made public as to what ones were available and could be done now under current guidance and what would need to be done for the other ones to be moved into common practice. Has anything similar been done? Have you done that kind of analysis with the Urban Street Design Guide?
Right. So as I mentioned, we're in the process of putting that together with FHWA. Again, the exact form that will take may be more of a frequently asked questions rather than just a table. In particular because whereas the Bikeway Design Guide was introducing a lot of markings and combinations of markings that may have been ambiguous as to whether or not they were geometric design issues or actually sort of new markings that needed to be within the METCD. Much of the material, I would argue the majority of the material in the Street Design Guide really doesn't sort of fall under that same category. A lot of what we're sort of what we're showing and visualizing are things that people are already using and are already either in the Green Book or the METCD, but they're really emphasizing the urban and sort of pointing out how to sort of put some of those elements together into a kind of total multimodal design. So that's definitely something that's going to be coming out, and once we do have that out, we'll be sending it out to through our newsletter and other channels.
Thank you. We received dozens of questions in advance of the webinar, and we will be forwarding all of those questions and the questions that were asked live during the webinar today to NACTO for their review and use in developing FAQs or other information related to this webinar. David, would you give us a sense of the time frame? When did this NACTO Urban Street Design Guide come out, and how is it available? How can people get their hands on it?
Right. So the guide was actually just launched in late September. So it's really kind of hot off the presses. You can order the guide online at Island Press, which is our publisher. And again, the actual promo code to get a 20% discount is for NACTO, number 4, and then NACTO. It's also available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble's, Powell's. And then lastly, I would just say the website is a really rich resource, and I think it's important to remember that a lot of the material, there's a lot of material including case studies and additional photographs and things that aren't actually even in the print edition that are on the website, and we're going to continue to add those over time. So, definitely use that and refer to it. And I actually, one thing I will say is I receive a lot of requests from people about using graphics and photos from the guide. And one of the things that we really want to stress is that, we really do see this as a resource that people can use, and they can, take renderings and concept sketches that are in the guide and bring those to community meetings, bring those to meetings with their city leaders. So that's very much the spirit of the document, and I encourage people to do that and to use the resource to its greatest extent.
So the last question, because one of the listeners is confused, and I admit that I am as well, is the guide available online, or must it be purchased through Island Press?
The guide is available online at nacto.org/USDG.
And one may also purchase a hard copy of it through Island Press and other sources, as you said.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And I guess I'll ask one last question. We're a minute over. How about the table of contents then? Is that available also on nacto.org, USDG?
Yeah, there's a table of contents on the website as well.
Okay, good. This has been a rich and full webinar. We've really done a very quick review of this guide. I urge everyone to take a look at it, study it. I have enjoyed reading through it myself. I had it on display at the American Public Health Association conference. A lot of people were very interested in how this particular guide can further encourage people to be more active, more physically active on a daily basis in their communities, how streets can become more welcoming and inviting. We've had 4 great presenters, and again, I'd like to thank David Vega-Barakowitz, Michael Flynn, Michael King, and Peter Kuntz. On behalf of the Association of Pedestrian and Bicycle Professionals, APBP, staff and board, and all of our members, we're grateful for everyone who attended today and wish you the best in the work that you do. And with that, we'll close the webinar and hope to see you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.